we've learned a lot, frankly, about how exactly this law was put together. Ezra just wrote a column for the New York Times explaining how in some ways his interview with Jon Stewart got things absolutely right. And in some ways, to be totally honest, he and I got some things wrong when we were initially talking about this bill.
Well, the Biden administration, which no longer exists, but people who were senior in the Biden administration were very upset with that clip and that argument. In fact, they were very, like Bharat Ramamurthy, who I'm sure you know, former deputy director of President Biden's National Economic Council, he actually called that clip deeply misleading and saying that the process, the cumbersome broadband process, was largely at the insistence of GOP senators as a condition for their votes for that Infrastructure Act. And he says these GOP politicians acted at the behest of large incumbent internet providers who did not want a dollar spent to build new infrastructure where they were already providing service. Another former Biden official, Alex Jacques, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing his name correctly, said it's disappointing to see Ezra Klein get lazy to sell books here. The irony is that we had a simple, straightforward broadband bill. Moderate Dems and Republicans forced a state-by-state Frankenstein instead. They're saying, not just you got it wrong, they're saying you're being misleading to sell books. Biden folks tend not to be very emotive from my experience. That's pretty strong attack on you both.
Well, we're definitely not misleading on purpose to sell books, right? We were trying to represent our best understanding of the BEAD program as we understand it. And when we published our first, or when it was published, our first descriptions of this bill, people like Bharat, as you said, people from the Biden administration got in touch with us and they said, you're not actually describing the way that this bill was put together accurately. There's some nuance that you're missing. And so we listened. And Ezra published an article in the New York Times, like a 1,500, 1,800 word article, where he talked to people like Jake Sullivan and Bharat with Biden's economic team. And they said, look, in some ways, you've incorrectly described the elements that were responsible for this 14-step process, this Frankenstein monster. But in other ways, and this is so important, in other ways, you've underrepresented just how difficult it is to build anything in government, in part because of the rules that we've put in our own way. Jake Sullivan has this absolutely sensational quote in the piece where he says that every single time the government essentially tries to step into the physical world to build something, they are entirely swept up in rules and regulations, like the Lilliputians, sweeping up Gulliver with their rope. And so there's a really subtle way in which, yes, the reason why this law was overlarded with regulations had to do with rules that Republicans and ISPs, internet service providers, wanted to overlay into the law.
But you didn't say that in the book or in the interview. You concede that you missed that out. You're telling me you got some of it wrong. You just said that a few moments ago.
Yes, we got some of this wrong in the process of describing it. But just to be clear, the BEAD example was not in the book.